The call to police. It was a busy afternoon at the airport, and the hum of activity filled the air. Travelers hurried through the terminal, dragging suitcases behind them, while flight attendants stood by the gates preparing for the next wave of passengers. Amid the chaos, a young boy sat alone on a bench, waiting for his father. His name was Jamal, and he was 12 years old. His father, a busy man who worked as a pilot for a major airline, had promised him that he would be there soon. Jamal was accustomed to waiting for his father. His job often took him away from home, and Jamal had learned to be patient. He wasn't like the other kids who played games or ran around in the waiting area. Jamal preferred the quiet, the calm, the solace of being alone even in a crowded place like this. He had his small backpack resting on his knees, his eyes gazing at the floor as he fidgeted with the straps. He didn't mind the noise. It was part of the routine. What he wasn't prepared for, however, was the attention he was about to receive. Across the terminal, a middle-aged man in a crisp pilot uniform stood waiting for his flight. He adjusted his aviator sunglasses as he glanced around, looking for any sign of delay in the boarding process. He wasn't used to seeing children alone in an airport. Most kids were with their families or playing games, not sitting by themselves in such a large place. As he walked past Jamal, the pilot's gaze lingered on the young boy. Something about the sight made him uneasy. The boy seemed out of place, alone in the middle of so much movement. There was no reason for this unease, no apparent danger. But still, something about the boy's presence didn't sit right with him. Perhaps it was because Jamal didn't fit the usual profile of a child waiting for a parent at the airport. Most kids were laughing, running around, or at least looking at their phones. This boy was still, too still. The pilot's mind began to wander, and before he knew it, a thought crept into his head. What if he's up to something? It was a dangerous thought, and the pilot immediately felt guilty for even considering it. But he couldn't shake the feeling. He had no reason to suspect the boy of anything, but still, he thought, maybe it was better to be safe than sorry. He pulled out his phone and dialed the airport security number. The call was brief, but enough to set events into motion. The pilot explained that he had seen a child sitting alone in the terminal, and something about the situation felt off. He didn't know why, but he had a bad feeling. He asked them to send someone to check on the boy. The dispatcher on the other end didn't question the pilot's request. After all, this was the kind of call they were trained to respond to. The dispatcher assured him that security would be sent immediately. As the pilot ended the call, a wave of relief washed over him. He had done the right thing, he told himself. The authorities would make sure the boy wasn't lost or in danger. He walked away, his mind already on his next task, completely unaware of the ripple effect his decision was about to cause. Jamal had noticed the pilot glancing at him, but he didn't think much of it. People stared sometimes, especially when they saw a kid sitting alone. He had grown used to it over the years, but when a security guard approached him a few minutes later, he felt a pang of unease in his chest. The guard was a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a stern expression. She asked Jamal what he was doing, and he explained, trying to sound calm despite the growing nerves in his stomach. He told her he was waiting for his father, that he was fine and there was no reason to worry. But the guard didn't seem convinced. She asked him again if he was sure he was okay, her eyes scanning the area as if expecting someone to be watching from a distance. Jamal felt his palms begin to sweat. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the more the woman pressed, the more he began to feel like he had. Before long, 2 more officers appeared, walking toward him with a sense of purpose. They too began questioning Jamal, their questions rapid-fire, one after another. Where is your father? How long have you been here? Do you know who to contact if you need help? Jamal's heart raced as he fumbled for the words to explain. He tried to tell them he was fine, that his father was a pilot and he'd be here any moment. But the officers didn't seem to care. One of them took out a radio and began speaking to dispatch, calling in for more help just in case. Jamal's confusion turned to fear. What had he done wrong? Why were these officers acting so strange? His mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. Maybe he was being arrested. Maybe they thought he was up to something. He had heard about things like that before. People assumed the worst sometimes, especially when you looked different from everyone else. And Jamal knew he looked different. He couldn't help it. His skin was darker, and that had always been something that set him apart. It felt like hours before his father finally appeared. Jamal's heart lifted as he saw the familiar face of his dad walking toward him. his uniform unmistakable. The father's presence brought a sense of calm to Jamal, even though the tension was still thick in the air. The officers turned their attention to the man as he approached, and Jamal could see the confusion and embarrassment written on their faces. His father walked right up to the officers and, without missing a beat, asked them what was going on. They quickly tried to explain, but the father didn't let them finish. He was the FAA administrator, the highest authority in the airport system, and right now he wasn't happy. His voice dropped, steady but firm, as he demanded to know why his son had been questioned without cause. The officers stammered, unable to give a proper answer, realizing they had made a grave mistake. Jamal stood silently next to his father, feeling both relief and a wave of anger bubbling up inside him. He knew why he had been treated this way, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. His father, however, was not done. He wasn't going to let this go, not now, not ever. Jamal's life was about to change forever, and the man who had called the police would soon learn the consequences of his snap judgment. The police arrive. The moment Jamal's father stepped forward, everything seemed to slow down. His presence commanded attention, and the airport that had once felt like a blur of noise and motion now felt eerily still. The officers, once so confident in their questioning of Jamal, seemed suddenly unsure, their body language stiff and uncertain. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others, unsure of how to proceed now that the situation had escalated. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he stood next to his father, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He felt a strange mix of relief that his father was finally here, but also a deep, gnawing unease. It wasn't just the officers that made him feel this way. It was the realization that everything that had happened, everything that had led to this moment, was a result of who he was. He didn't know how to explain it, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something that had been a part of his life long before this airport incident. His father, calm and composed, didn't wait for the officers to find the right words. Instead, he took control of the situation with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. His voice, deep and authoritative, broke the silence. He asked the officers what had happened, but his tone wasn't one of curiosity. It was a command for an explanation. Jamal could see the unease in their eyes as they stammered, struggling to give a coherent response. They explained that they had been called to investigate a suspicious situation, that Jamal, a young boy sitting alone in the terminal, seemed to be acting strangely and might be in danger. His father, however, wasn't buying it. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging, and asked why they had decided to call the police in the first place. The officers tried to explain that they had acted on a tip, that they were simply following protocol, but the explanation felt hollow. Jamal's father wasn't looking for excuses. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why his son had been treated like a criminal simply for being alone in a public space. Why hadn't they taken a moment to understand the situation before jumping to conclusions? As the father pressed further, the officer's discomfort only grew. One of the officers, a man in his mid-30s with a sharp jawline and a badge that gleamed in the fluorescent light, glanced over at the pilot who had called in the report. The pilot, who had been standing in the background, now looked like he regretted his decision. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the attention that had been drawn to him. The father noticed this too and turned his gaze toward the man, his eyes narrowing as he took in the pilot's posture. It was as if the pilot had been waiting for someone to come to the boy's defense. But now that the moment had arrived, he was unsure how to handle it. He had called the police. He had assumed the worst about Jamal. And now, standing in front of a man who held significant authority, the pilot seemed smaller than he had moments before. His regret was written all over his face. But Jamal's father wasn't interested in his apologies. He was interested in accountability. The officers and the pilot fumbled over their words, trying to justify their actions, but none of it made sense. Jamal's father, who had grown accustomed to people questioning his authority because of his position, wasn't easily swayed. He wasn't just an FAA administrator. He was a father. And this wasn't about airport protocol. It was about his son being unfairly treated because of his appearance, because of the assumptions people made based on the color of his skin. This was something Jamal's father had dealt with for years, but it was different now. It was different because this time it wasn't just him facing the consequences of systemic bias. It was his son, and he wasn't going to let that slide, not now. Not ever. Jamal stood quietly beside his father, his mind spinning. He had never seen his dad like this. His father, always so composed, so unflappable, was now visibly angry, and Jamal wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was relieved that his father was standing up for him, that he was taking control of the situation. But another part of him felt small, exposed. Why had this happened? Why had the officers treated him like he was some sort of threat? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had been sitting there waiting for his dad, just like he had done countless times before. It didn't make sense. Jamal felt the sting of confusion, the hurt of being misunderstood, and the uncomfortable truth that the world saw him differently because of his skin. He didn't know how to explain it to his father, but he knew the feeling all too well. As the situation unfolded, Jamal's mind drifted back to the moments before his father arrived. The constant questioning, the eyes that seemed to judge him without reason, it had all felt so wrong. But the worst part was the helplessness. He had tried to explain himself, tried to tell the officers that his father was coming, that there was no need for them to worry. But it hadn't mattered. They hadn't listened. And that was the part that stung the most. The fact that in that moment he hadn't been seen as a child in need of help, but as a potential threat, just because of how he looked. He wanted to tell his father how it made him feel, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stood there, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. Jamal's father, seeing the silent hurt in his son's eyes, softened for a moment, though his anger still simmered beneath the surface. He turned to Jamal, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jamal looked up at his dad, seeking reassurance, but there was no hiding the disappointment in his father's eyes. Jamal knew what that look meant. His father was proud of him, yes, but he also knew that this was a painful lesson. It wasn't a lesson in how to deal with people who made assumptions about him based on his appearance. That was something Jamal had learned long ago. No, this was a lesson in the harsh reality of the world they lived in. The world where even a young boy could be treated as a suspect for no other reason than the color of his skin. The officers, now fully aware of the mistake they had made, began to apologize, but their words fell flat. Jamal's father wasn't interested in their apologies. What mattered now was how they would handle the situation moving forward. Would they learn from this? Would they change? Or would they continue to perpetuate the same harmful biases that led to moments like this? Jamal's father wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this go, not now. Not ever. An unlikely bond. The tension in the air was palpable, but as Jamal stood beside his father, something began to shift. The officers, now aware of their mistake, continued to offer apologies that felt more like words than genuine remorse. Jamal's father, ever the professional, acknowledged their apologies but made it clear that words alone would not suffice. What happened today wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. It was about the underlying assumptions and prejudices that led to it. As the situation started to diffuse, Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions, and it wasn't just the immediate relief that his father had arrived. It was something deeper, something Jamal had never fully understood until now. It was the realization that the world saw him differently because of the way he looked. The color of his skin was something he couldn't change, something that seemed to define him in ways he didn't fully comprehend. And it wasn't just the officers or the pilot who treated him differently. It was everyone. Every time he walked into a room, every time he spoke, every time he simply existed, he could feel the eyes on him. The silent judgment that followed him wherever he went. Jamal had always known this on some level, but it wasn't until today that the full weight of it hit him. As he stood there next to his father, he couldn't help but wonder if things would have been different if he had looked like everyone else. Would the pilot have noticed him? Would the officers have called the police? Would they have treated him like any other child simply waiting for his parent? The questions circled in his mind, but there were no easy answers. His father, though, had always been his rock. The one person in his life who made him feel safe, who showed him what true strength was. But today, Jamal saw a different side of his father, a side that, for all his calm composure, was deeply affected by the unfairness of the world they lived in. Jamal had never seen his father like this before. His father, the man who had always handled everything with grace and authority, now looked tired, worn down by the weight of the reality they faced. As they walked through the terminal, heading toward the exit, Jamal's father spoke softly, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that Jamal rarely heard in him. "You know, son," he began, "this isn't the first time I've had to deal with something like this. It won't be the last either." Jamal looked up at his father, his confusion clear. He had always admired his dad for the way he carried himself, the way he handled difficult situations with such calm and professionalism. But now, in the aftermath of what had just happened, Jamal realized that his father wasn't immune to the world's prejudices. He was just better at hiding it. His father continued, his eyes focused straight ahead, not looking at Jamal as if he was speaking more to himself than to his son. "I've had people question my authority, challenge my decisions, treat me like I'm less than what I am. And you know what? It's never easy. But you can't let it break you. You have to keep going. You have to keep fighting, because if you don't, if you let them win, then you're letting them decide who you are." Jamal listened closely, his heart heavy with understanding. His father wasn't just speaking to him about the incident at the airport. He was speaking about life. The fight for respect, the struggle to be seen as more than what others assumed you to be. Jamal had never thought about it like that before. To him, his father had always been a figure of authority, someone who stood above the fray. But now Jamal saw that his father too had to fight for his place in the world. And while he may have been able to mask it on the outside, there was no hiding the wear and tear that came with constantly having to prove himself. As they reached the parking garage, Jamal's father turned to him and placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. "Jamal, you need to know something. The world is going to judge you. They're going to assume things about you because of the way you look. It's wrong, but it's the reality. And you have to be strong enough to handle it. But you don't have to do it alone. You have me. You have your mother. You have the people who love you. And together we're going to show them that we won't be defined by their expectations." Jamal nodded, trying to absorb his father's words. There was so much to process, so much that he had never fully understood before. But as he stood there with his father, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he realized that his father wasn't just fighting for a seat at the table. He was fighting to make sure that his family, his son, had a place at that table too. The car ride home was quiet. Jamal looked out the window, watching the world pass by as the city lights flickered in the distance. His mind raced with the thoughts of what had happened that day, the emotions still raw, the confusion still lingering. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his father's words had given him something he hadn't had before. Clarity. He didn't have to let the world define him. He didn't have to let the biases of others determine his worth. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was something he could fight for. And he wasn't alone. When they arrived home, Jamal felt the weight of the day finally begin to lift. His mother was there waiting for them, a warm smile on her face as she greeted them at the door. She could see the exhaustion on their faces, the tension in their bodies, but she didn't ask any questions. She simply embraced her son, holding him close for a moment as if to shield him from the world outside. Jamal felt comfort in her arms, but there was something else now, something more than the usual love and protection. There was a sense of unity, of understanding. He knew that his parents were doing everything they could to protect him, but that protection also meant preparing him for the harsh realities of life. As Jamal lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He thought about the way the officers had treated him, the way the pilot had looked at him with suspicion. He thought about his father's anger, his calm assurance, his strength. He thought about the moment when his father had put his hand on his shoulder and spoken those words of wisdom. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. He wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations, and no matter how hard the world tried to push him down, he knew that he had the strength to rise above it. He had his family, and that was all he needed to fight. The truth revealed. The days following the incident at the airport passed slowly, each one lingering longer than the last as Jamal tried to move on from what had happened. The embarrassment still gnawed at him, though he tried to mask it with the routine of school, family dinners, and quiet evenings spent at home. His father, ever the pillar of strength, seemed determined to put the whole situation behind them. But for Jamal, the sting of being judged, the fear of being misunderstood didn't fade so easily. It wasn't just the airport or the police, it was the knowledge that what had happened to him, though isolated, was part of something much larger, something he couldn't escape. His father had spoken to him about strength and resilience, about not letting the world define him. But Jamal was still trying to make sense of it all. He knew his father had lived through similar situations, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. It was one thing to hear someone else's story, another to live it. And right now, Jamal wasn't sure he was ready to live it. One afternoon after school, Jamal came home to find his father sitting at the kitchen table, his face drawn and serious. There was something different in his father's demeanor, something that wasn't the usual calm assurance. Jamal had learned over the years to recognize when his father was troubled, and today there was no mistaking it. His father looked up as Jamal entered the room, his eyes tired yet focused. "Sit down, son," his father said, motioning to the chair across from him. Jamal hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The tension in the room was palpable, and he could feel his heart racing. His father took a deep breath before speaking again. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "About what happened at the airport." Jamal's stomach tightened. He had been trying to forget the whole ordeal, but his father's words brought it all rushing back. The officer's questions, the pilot's judgment, the cold suspicion that had been aimed at him for no other reason than the color of his skin. "Dad," Jamal began, his voice faltering. "Isn't it over now? I mean, the police apologized and the pilot said he was sorry. What else is there to talk about?" His father's expression softened, but there was still a heaviness in his eyes. "It's not just about what happened that day," he replied. "It's about the bigger picture. You see, son, the truth is that what happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. It's something that happens every day to people who look like us. It's something I've had to face my whole life, and it's something you'll have to face too. The police, the pilot, they were wrong, yes. But they acted based on their assumptions about you, about who you are and what you might do simply because of the way you look." Jamal sat back in his chair, the weight of his father's words settling heavily in his chest. He had always known that things were different for him, but hearing his father speak so plainly about it made it all feel so much more real. He had grown up with his father's strength as a shield, his father's ability to navigate the world with grace and confidence despite the biases he faced. But now Jamal was beginning to understand just how difficult that had been, just how much his father had to fight every day to carve out a place for himself. And it wasn't just his father. There were countless others who had to fight the same battle, to endure the same biases, day in and day out. Jamal felt a mix of anger and helplessness surge through him as he realized that he was being asked to take up that fight too. "But why?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why do people think like that? Why do they judge us just because of how we look?" His father's gaze softened and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he spoke. "It's a long story, son. It's rooted in history, in the way people have been taught to fear what's different. For centuries, people who looked like us have been painted as threats, as something to be feared, something less than human. It's not your fault, Jamal. It's not something you did, and it's not something you can fix. But you have to understand that it's a battle that has been fought for generations, and it's a battle we continue to face." Jamal listened closely, trying to wrap his mind around the idea that his life, his future, was going to be shaped by something that he couldn't control. It wasn't just about one bad experience, one bad day. It was about a lifetime of facing prejudice, of being viewed through a lens that wasn't his own. "So what do we do?" Jamal asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His father smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We keep moving forward. We fight for what's right. We don't let them define us, but we also don't let them take away our power. We take the lessons from these experiences and use them to make us stronger. You, Jamal, you have the power to change things, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's a fight that requires patience, and more than that, it requires understanding." The conversation was heavy, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from Jamal's shoulders. He had been walking through life with a sense of confusion, not fully understanding why he felt different, why he was treated differently. But now, sitting at the kitchen table with his father, he began to see the bigger picture. His father wasn't just a man who worked in aviation. He was a man who had spent his entire life fighting against the assumptions others had made about him. And now Jamal understood that fight was not only his father's battle, but his as well. Later that evening, as Jamal sat in his room, he thought about everything his father had said. He thought about how for so long he had tried to be invisible, to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But now he realized that he couldn't afford to remain invisible anymore. If he wanted to change the way people saw him, he had to first change the way he saw himself. The fight wasn't just about standing up to the biases of others. It was about standing up to the doubts he had carried inside him. It was about taking control of his own narrative and refusing to let anyone else write it for him. Jamal wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it head on. He wasn't going to let the world define him by his skin color or his background. He wasn't going to let the assumptions of others dictate his worth. His father had taught him that. And as Jamal lay in bed that night, the weight of the day still heavy on his chest, he knew that he had taken the first step in a journey that would last his entire life. But it was a journey he was ready to take. He wasn't going to walk it alone. Betrayal and confusion. The days after the conversation with his father weighed heavily on Jamal. Though his father had spoken of strength and resilience, Jamal couldn't shake the sense of confusion that lingered inside him. It wasn't just the misunderstanding at the airport, though that event still haunted his thoughts. It was the knowledge that the world would always see him as different, always see him through a lens that wasn't of his making. He had always tried to fit in, to blend in with those around him, but now he realized that it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply exist in the world. He had to fight for his place in it. And that realization left him feeling more isolated than ever. One morning, about a week after the incident at the airport, Jamal's father came home with a troubled look on his face. The usual calm that his father carried with him was absent. Jamal had never seen him look this way before. His father sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes distant and tired, and Jamal could feel the tension building between them even before he spoke. "Jamal, there's something I need to tell you," his father began, his voice unusually soft. Jamal looked up from his cereal, his stomach suddenly in knots. He hadn't heard his father sound like this in years, and the unease was enough to make his heart race. "What is it, Dad?" Jamal asked, his voice tentative. His father took a deep breath, rubbing his eyes as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "I've been contacted by the airport," he said slowly. "Apparently, the officers involved in that situation have filed a report against me. They claim that I was disrespectful and caused a scene, and the pilot has backed them up." Jamal's world seemed to shift on its axis. The ground beneath him felt unstable, and the air in the room grew thick with disbelief. He couldn't understand it. After everything that had happened, after his father had stood up for him, after the apology they had received, why was this happening now? "What are you talking about?" Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would they do that?" His father's expression darkened. "It's not about what happened that day, Jamal," he said. "It's about me. It's about who I am and what I represent. The pilot, the officers, they don't like the fact that I'm in the position I'm in. They don't like the fact that someone like me is in charge of their airport, someone who isn't like them. And now, they're using this incident to try to discredit me, to undermine everything I've worked for." Jamal felt as if the room were spinning. The idea that his father, the man he admired more than anyone in the world, could be targeted like this was incomprehensible. "But Dad, that's not fair," Jamal protested. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were just standing up for me. You were just doing what any parent would do." His father sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "I know, son. But fairness doesn't always play a role in situations like this. The truth doesn't always matter. People will always find a way to twist things to fit their own narrative, especially when they don't want to accept the truth about their own biases." The weight of his father's words settled heavily on Jamal. He had always admired his father's strength, his ability to handle pressure without flinching. But now, seeing him vulnerable, seeing him face this kind of attack, Jamal felt the burden of the world shift onto his own shoulders. The thought that his father was being betrayed, that the people who should have supported him were instead turning against him, made Jamal's chest tighten. The confusion in his mind deepened as he tried to process it all. Why were they doing this? What had his father done to deserve this kind of treatment? "I don't understand," Jamal said quietly. "You've worked so hard to get where you are. You've done everything right. Why are they doing this to you? His father looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. Because that's how it works, son, he said softly. When you're in a position of power, when you've worked your whole life to earn respect and a place at the table, there will always be people who want to tear you down. There will always be people who want to make you feel like you don't belong. They'll use anything they can, any mistake, any misunderstanding to take away your credibility. And if you're not careful, they'll succeed. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of his father's words. Jamal felt his throat tighten as he processed what his father had just said. He wanted to do something, wanted to help in some way, but he felt helpless. The idea that people could be so petty, so cruel, that they would try to tear someone down simply because of their position, their skin, or their success, was too much for Jamal to understand. It felt like a betrayal not just of his father, but of everything he had been taught about fairness and justice. "Isn't there anything we can do?" Jamal asked, his voice cracking. "How can they just do this to you?" His father gave him a sad smile. "There's not much we can do right now, son. The system is set up to protect people like them. But I'll fight this, I have to. I won't let them get away with it." Jamal nodded, though the sadness in his heart refused to fade. He had always known that his father was a fighter, but now, the fight felt different. It wasn't just about standing up for what was right. It was about survival. His father was fighting to keep everything they had worked for, everything he had earned, from being destroyed by people who didn't even know him. And in that moment, Jamal felt the weight of his father's struggles in a way he never had before. As the days went by, Jamal watched his father navigate the difficult waters of this new conflict. The reports against him piled up, and the pressure continued to mount. But Jamal also saw something else, a determination in his father's eyes, a quiet strength that refused to be broken. Even when the world seemed to be working against him, his father stood tall, unwavering. Jamal realized for the first time that his father's strength wasn't just in his position or his authority. It was in his ability to face adversity head-on, to keep going even when everything seemed stacked against him. And it was in that moment that Jamal knew he had to do the same. He couldn't let the world break him, just like his father hadn't let it break him. It wasn't just about fighting for his father's honor. It was about fighting for himself, for his place in a world that too often refused to see him for who he really was. The final stand as the days turned into weeks. The tension at home seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Jamal could feel the change in his father, the strain of the ongoing battle weighing on him in ways that Jamal had never seen before. He had always known his father to be a man of strength and composure, someone who faced every challenge with a steady hand. But now, Jamal could see the cracks forming beneath that calm exterior. His father wasn't just fighting for his own reputation or for his job. He was fighting for something much bigger. He was fighting for their future, for their family's place in a world that had already judged them before they even had a chance to prove themselves. It was a fight that had started long before the incident at the airport, but now it had become personal. Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. His father's struggle had become his own. The confusion, the sense of betrayal, the hurt, it all felt too much for a 12-year-old to carry. He tried to block it out, to focus on school and the things that used to bring him comfort, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes of the world on him, judging him, labeling him before he even had a chance to speak. It was as if he was invisible to those around him, except when they saw the color of his skin. He wasn't just Jamal, the kid who liked to play video games and read comic books. He was Jamal, the black boy, and in the eyes of many, that was all he would ever be. But even in the face of everything he was dealing with, Jamal knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let his father fight this battle alone. If his father could stand tall in the face of adversity, so could he. Jamal wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to find a way to make a difference, to stand up for himself and for his father. He wasn't going to let the world define him, just like he wasn't going to let it define his dad. One evening after dinner, Jamal's father sat him down again. This time his expression was different. There was a sense of urgency in his eyes, a quiet fire that hadn't been there before. "Jamal," his father began, his voice low but firm, "I've been in touch with the legal team. We're going to take this fight to the next level. We're not just going to let them continue to spread lies about me." Jamal's heart began to race as his father continued. But I need your help, son. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about showing everyone that we won't back down, that we're not afraid to stand up for what's right. It's time we take action. Jamal could feel the weight of his father's words pressing on him, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, something stirred within him. He had spent so much time being scared, being unsure of himself, that he had forgotten what it meant to fight back. This wasn't just about his father. It was about them as a family taking a stand together. Jamal knew this was his moment. He couldn't let fear control him anymore. Over the next few days, Jamal and his father worked together, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, and preparing for the fight ahead. It wasn't just about clearing his father's name. It was about sending a message to the people who had tried to tear him down. They would not be silenced. They would not be pushed aside. Jamal didn't know how long this battle would take or what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let the world's assumptions define him. The final showdown came sooner than they had expected. The airport had called a meeting to address the incident, and Jamal's father had been asked to attend. The pilot, the officers, and their legal team would be there, and so would Jamal. He had never seen his father in this kind of situation before. He had always seen him as the calm, composed man who solved problems with ease. But now, as they walked into the conference room together, Jamal saw a different side of his father. His shoulders were straight, his eyes focused. He wasn't going to let them break him. And Jamal, standing beside him, knew that he wasn't going to let them break him either. The meeting started with the airport's legal team presenting their side of the story, claiming that Jamal's father had acted inappropriately when confronting the officers and the pilot. They argued that his actions had caused a disturbance, that he had overreacted in the face of a simple misunderstanding. The pilot and the officers backed them up, each one offering their version of events. Jamal's father listened in silence, his face expressionless as the accusations flew. But Jamal could see the fire in his father's eyes, the quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. When it was his father's turn to speak, the room fell silent. Jamal's father stood up slowly, his presence filling the room. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. He simply spoke the truth. "I didn't overreact," he began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I acted in defense of my son. I will always defend my family, and I will never apologize for that." He turned to the pilot and the officers, his gaze steady and unyielding. What happened that day wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a result of assumptions based on nothing more than the color of my son's skin. You called the police on a child because you thought he was a threat, simply because he was alone in the terminal. And for that, you owe him an apology. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jamal felt a sense of pride swell within him as he watched his father stand tall, his voice firm with conviction. This wasn't just about the airport. It was about a larger issue, a societal problem that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And his father was not backing down. When the meeting ended, there was no immediate resolution, no clear victory. But as Jamal and his father walked out of the conference room together, Jamal knew something had changed. His father had stood up for what was right, had faced down the people who had tried to tear him down, and had done so with integrity and strength. And in that moment, Jamal knew that he could do the same. He wasn't going to let the world define him or his father. He wasn't going to let the biases of others shape his future. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first step. And no matter what happened next, Jamal knew that they were ready. Ready to face whatever the world threw at them. Together, a new beginning. The days following the meeting were filled with a sense of uncertainty. The legal battle was far from over, and Jamal's father knew that there would be many more hurdles to overcome before they could truly say they had won. The pilot and the officers had stuck to their story, and the airport had made no immediate moves to acknowledge their part in the incident. But despite the challenges, something had changed within Jamal. He no longer felt like a passive observer in his father's fight. He felt like an active participant, someone who had a voice, someone who could make a difference. The days of hiding in the shadows, of shrinking away from confrontation, were behind him. He had seen his father stand up not just for himself, but for the people he loved, and Jamal knew that he could do the same. The battle wasn't just about clearing his father's name. It was about standing up for what was right, for justice, for equality. Jamal had learned something about himself in the past few weeks. He had learned that he wasn't powerless, that he had the strength to face the challenges that life threw his way. And that realization was the first step toward something bigger, toward understanding who he truly was and what he was capable of. The truth was, Jamal had always known that the world saw him differently. He had always known that his skin color made him a target for assumptions and prejudice. But now he understood that he didn't have to accept those assumptions. He didn't have to accept the labels that others tried to place on him. He could define himself. As the weeks went by, Jamal's relationship with his father grew stronger. They spent more time together, not just working on the case, but talking about life, about the challenges they both faced, about the future. Jamal's father had always been a man of few words, but now he opened up more, sharing stories of his own struggles, of the times when he had been knocked down and had to fight his way back up. Jamal learned about the sacrifices his father had made to get where he was, the obstacles he had faced just to earn a seat at the table. His father spoke with pride, but also with a quiet sadness, as if the weight of everything he had been through had never quite lifted. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jamal turned to his father. "Dad," he said, his voice thoughtful, "do you think this is going to change things? I mean, with everything that's happened, do you think people will start seeing us differently?" His father didn't answer right away. He simply looked out at the sunset, his gaze distant as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of experience. "I don't know, son," he said. "I don't know if things will change overnight, but I do know that we have to keep fighting. We have to keep pushing, because if we don't, then nothing will ever change. It's not just about us. It's about everyone who's been told they don't belong, about everyone who's been judged based on the way they look or where they come from. We have to be the ones to break that cycle, to show the world that we won't accept the way things have always been." Jamal nodded, taking in his father's words. There was a quiet strength in his father's voice, a determination that Jamal could feel in his bones. His father had been fighting this fight for so long, but now he had a new ally, his son, and together, they were stronger than they had ever been before. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The legal battle continued, but the pressure on the airport and the officers involved began to mount. Jamal's father was relentless, pushing for justice not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been unfairly treated, every person who had ever been judged based on their skin color or their background. The airport, under increasing scrutiny, was forced to confront the truth. The legal team representing them began to backpedal, offering concessions in the face of mounting evidence that the officers had acted inappropriately. It wasn't an easy fight, and it wasn't over yet, but Jamal could see the changes happening, could feel the momentum building. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the living room reading a book, his father came in with a look on his face that Jamal had never seen before. It was a mixture of exhaustion and relief, of quiet triumph. "Jamal," his father said, his voice softer than usual, "I think we've won." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, setting the book aside. His father smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "The airport has agreed to settle. They've admitted to their mistakes, and they've agreed to implement new training for their staff to prevent something like this from happening again. It's not the full victory we were hoping for, but it's a step in the right direction." Jamal felt a rush of emotion flood through him. Relief, pride, a sense of accomplishment. His father had fought for what was right, and he had won. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making a difference, about showing the world that they would no longer be silenced. In the days that followed, Jamal and his father spent time reflecting on everything they had been through. The legal battles, the long hours, the uncertainty, it had all been worth it. They had faced down their fears and come out stronger on the other side. Jamal had learned more about his father in the past few weeks than he ever had before. He had learned about the sacrifices, the struggles, the quiet strength that had carried him through it all. And in the process, Jamal had come to realize something important. The fight wasn't over, but it was just the beginning. As Jamal lay in bed that night, thinking about everything that had happened, he realized that he wasn't the same person he had been when this all started. He had grown in ways he hadn't imagined, had learned to stand up for himself, for his father, for what was right. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that whatever the future held, he was ready to face it. The world might try to label him, try to define him, But Jamal knew now that he had the power to choose who he was, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The journey wasn't over, but it was just the beginning. And Jamal was ready for whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jamal couldn't help but notice how much had changed, not just in his life, but in the way he saw the world. The weight of everything that had happened, the airport incident, the betrayal, the fight for justice, had shaped him in ways he never could have anticipated. He had learned so much about strength, resilience, and the unspoken battles that people face every day. His father had shown him what it meant to stand tall in the face of adversity, to keep fighting even when the odds seemed stacked against you. And Jamal had come to understand that the fight wasn't just about winning, it was about making a difference, about ensuring that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles. Jamal walked through the halls of his school with a newfound sense of confidence. He was no longer the quiet boy who sat in the back of the class trying to blend in with the crowd. He had a voice now, a voice that he wasn't afraid to use. He had learned that silence was no longer an option, that he couldn't sit idly by while injustice took place. He spoke out when he saw something wrong. He stood up when he saw someone being treated unfairly, and he used his voice to advocate for change. No matter how small it seemed, his classmates began to notice the difference in him. They noticed the way he carried himself, the way he spoke with conviction, the way he refused to be ignored. It wasn't about seeking attention or proving anything to anyone. It was about being true to himself and to the lessons he had learned over the past few months. Jamal had always known that the world saw him differently, but now, he was determined to make sure that they saw him for who he truly was. Not a label, not a stereotype, but a person with dreams, hopes, and the power to change the world. Jamal's father continued his work, fighting not just for his own place in the world, but for the many others who had been overlooked, marginalized, and judged based on things they couldn't control. They both knew that the battle wasn't over, that there would be many more challenges ahead. But they also knew that they were stronger together, that no matter what the world threw their way, they could face it with strength and dignity. The fight was long and it was difficult, but it was a fight they were both willing to continue. As Jamal looked out of the window one evening, watching the sun set behind the horizon, he realized that the journey he had been on was far from finished. He had come a long way, but he still had so much more to learn, so much more to give. The world would continue to try and define him, to put him in a box that didn't fit, but Jamal knew that he didn't have to let that happen. He was more than the labels people tried to place on him. He was more than the prejudice he had faced. He was his own person, capable of making his own path. With a deep breath, Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. He had learned that strength wasn't just about physical power or success. It was about standing firm in the face of challenges, knowing who you were and never backing down. It was about using your voice to speak up for what was right, even when it seemed like no one was listening. And it was about continuing the fight, not for the recognition or the accolades, but for the people who needed it most. Jamal knew the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be obstacles, there would be setbacks, but there would also be victories, small and large. And as long as he kept fighting for the truth, for justice, and for his place in the world, he knew that he was on the right path. He wasn't just his father's son. He was Jamal. And that was enough. The end.